Brand Salon. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's lecture. Andrew is a popular speaker and brings into his talks his experience as chief executive of the auto clubs in Europe, as well as through Lloyd's of London and the City, who insure the ships that he will talk about today. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage at this time, Mr. Andrew Johnson.
Amy, thank you as always, and thank you to you and the team for all the support and leadership here. I'm going to rewind. When I was talking about Columbus yesterday, I dropped in conversation that there had been some research on his heritage and that there was an announcement due last night. So I can now tell you that the tomb in Seville Cathedral, which I showed you yesterday, does indeed contain remains of Christopher Columbus, having checked the DNA against that of his son, Hernando. It is not the complete remains. So there are bits of him somewhere else, which explains why Valladolid, Santo Domingo, Cuba might all have some claim to have at least part of Christopher Columbus. That's not a great surprise because that's actually in line with what people have tended to believe. The surprise comes next. Someone said to me afterwards yesterday, I understand that some of Columbus's records were written in Hebrew. How would that be? And I said, I really don't know because there's no confirmed knowledge that he was of Jewish faith. Although it has been suggested, but there's no sort of confirmed knowledge. Well, there is now. The DNA tests that were done yesterday, or that were announced yesterday, had been done over several years, and they were completed by a man called Miguel Lorente, who is a professor in these things. And the tests have proved that both the Y chromosome, which is the male chromosome, and the mitochondrial DNA, which is what comes from the mother, show clear traits compatible with Sephardic Judaism. And just for those who don't know, the Sephard is the Hebrew term for Spain. And they have suggested, from what they have, without clear proof, but they have suggested that he may possibly have come from Valencia in Spain, which is where Kathy and I lived for the last 20 years. So history changes, and I'm sure there will be more news and more information come in time. But back to today's talk, we as modern cruise passengers see the ship as a destination in itself. We don't think of speed as the main factor. If we did, we wouldn't be tootling around Prince Edward Island at the moment. But of course, that wasn't always so. For over a century and a half, there was a prize called the Blue Ribbon for speed in the North Atlantic crossing. And so that's my subject today, a story of some of the people who crossed the Atlantic to make a better life for themselves and some of the great ships that competed for the fastest crossing. I have shared with you a couple of signs at the beginnings of my previous talks, and I'm going to bore you again with a couple of signs today that just seemed rather appropriate or possibly inappropriate. For example, next to a funeral director in Chester in the north of England, we spotted an enormous advert for the movie The Walking Dead. And I think next to a funeral director that might be really clever positioning, I'm not sure. And then we spotted this one, a pilot lounge at an airport. Now, I am all for inclusivity. I think it's essential that everyone has an opportunity. But the idea that pilots might need access to Braille signs is a bit disturbing. But back to my story. This, as you will know, is Elvis Presley. And he was born on January the 8th in 1935. 1935 is an important year in my story. Elvis is remembered in a number of different ways. including in the port of Bremerhaven in Germany, because it was there that he disembarked to fulfill his military service. And the story, my story, starts then for a couple of reasons. One is the very impressive Museum of German Emigration, which picks up on some of what I've said before about diaspora and relates to the ships that I'm talking about today. There are lots of places with museums. The one on immigration in Halifax is good, very good, but this is outstanding. And so I would say to you, if you ever have the opportunity to visit Bremerhaven and you have an interest in migration or these grand ocean liners, then I would suggest you go there. Your ticket gives you the name of one of the emigrants who had passed through this terminal, and you follow their story as you go around. It looks at the dreadful conditions of travel in steerage, the significantly relevant relative first-class luxury, and the intimidation of arrival at Ellis Island, which we passed on our way out of New York just a few days ago. If you want to, you are able to check family history records, and they have quite significant family history records. They're not just German-related. They also show the story of how immigration benefited and enriched European society. And I mentioned that yesterday, the day before yesterday, in my talk about European diaspora. The stories of emigration include some real horror stories. In 1847 alone, 100,000 Irish people sailed to the Americas, and an estimated 1 in 5 of those died from disease and malnutrition. Look at this. This is not a romantic representation of the conditions that they travelled in. Poorly maintained, badly provisioned. The vessels were known as coffin ships, and they ended up becoming the coffins of quite a few of the travellers. They sailed particularly from small, unregulated harbours in the west of Ireland. They broke many of the then appropriate laws about safety requirements. As I say, mortality rates were high. Fortunately, ship owners started to realise that the human cargo that they were carrying could be more beneficial to them if they took better care of it. And the race across the Atlantic became more about the wealthy passengers who would pay a premium for speed while providing improving conditions for those people who had to travel below decks. Speed then brings me to the second reason for mentioning 1935, because that was the year that Harold K. Hales, who was a British politician, a member of Parliament, the owner of the Hales Shipping Company, commissioned a Sheffield goldsmith to produce this large trophy to be presented to the fastest ships crossing the Atlantic. Sadly, he died in 1942 in a boating accident on the River Thames. I want to tell the story of how the coffin ships of the potato famine led to more and more ships crossing in greater and grander comfort, and how a number of them set to compete for this trophy. I will come back to the trophy once or twice during the talk. So the term blue riband is borrowed, stolen from horse racing, where it has tended to be a sign of award achievement success. Riband is a Middle English term for a ribbon, nothing more fancy than that. And there are numerous trophies in horse racing around the English-speaking world that have this same title. The race was really a series of unwritten rules. The criteria was the average speed rather than the passage time, and the blue ribbon accolade applied only to the more difficult westbound crossing, because you were crossing against the prevailing currents. 35 Atlantic liners have held the blue ribbon, even though for most of them there was no tangible reward or something to display. But 35 have been titled blue ribbon holders. 25 of them are British, 5 Germans, 3 Americans, and 1 each from Italy and France. 13 of them operated by Cunard, 5 by White Star Line. The Queen Mary was owned by Cunard White Star, so that's a further one. There were 4 owned by Norddeutsche, 2 by Collins, 2 by Inman, and 2 by Guillon, and 1 each by British American, Great Western, Hamburg America, and the Italian line. Compagnie Générale Transatlantique won 1, and finally, so did United States Line, and I will come to that story later on. The romance of it all even spread to things like children's toys. From the middle of the 19th century, many ships were built with quite significant government funding or subsidy to allow those ships to be brought into military service when conflict required. Indeed, Winston Churchill was quoted as saying that the Cunard Queens, so that's Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth, helped to shorten the Second World War by a year, simply because they were designed to go fast and furious across the Atlantic and nothing could catch them. And that was also true in terms of their use as troop ships as well as carriers. And even as recently as the Falklands in 1982, the QE2 and Canberra were put into service as troop carriers down there. So, during this period, certain names stand out. Mauretania, the grand old ship. She battled across the Atlantic for 23 years and never had the blue ribbon taken away from her. She was retired as the owner, still the holder of the blue ribbon. There was the unsinkable Titanic. I will come back to that a bit later on. There was the Kronprinz Wilhelm, made a wartime dash into Hampton Roads. Each of these is worthy of a thesis in its own right. So the blue ribbon is a prize awarded to the ship making the fastest crossing of the North Atlantic in terms of average speed between the Bishop Rock Lighthouse, just off the Scilly Isles here, and the Ambrose Light on the entrance to New York Harbour. Now, you will notice there that the ships travel quite far north. That's because that is the shortest crossing, the Grand Circle. And we, of course, are just around here at the moment, so they would still have a couple of days steaming time, or several days sailing time, from there to get down to New York. Until the 30s, the winner was the ship which averaged the highest rate of knots on the voyage. Lots of the titles were argued, hotly disputed, which led to the introduction of an actual award, the Hales Trophy, which I mentioned before. Speed is measured in knots, and as our captain said the other day, a knot is a nautical mile, which is equivalent to 1 minute of the arc of latitude. Now, in physical terms, that's 1.852 kilometres or 1.15078 miles. A little over a mile, a little less than a kilometre. What are the advantages of being the fastest ship at sea? Well, frankly, they are questionable. There's prestige, of course. Prestige to the company, especially. Passenger bookings would increase among those who wanted to be first across the pond, what today we might describe as the Concorde effect. Prestige was also bought by governments who wanted the record-breaking ships to be registered in their ports, in their countries. For example, I will mention the 4 ships of the German Lloyd Group, particularly the North German Lloyd Company, because they ruled the Atlantic for 10 years. The main disadvantage, and there were big disadvantages, the main disadvantage was the enormous cost of running these huge ships, especially once we got into steam out of sail. I mentioned the Kaiser Wilhelm. Kaiser Wilhelm de Grosse was the holder in 1897. She burnt 1 ton of coal for every knot of speed, every hour. So at a speed of 22 knots, you can imagine the enormous amount of fuel that had to be carried. And she needed every inch of passenger space that they could provide to bring in revenue. Well, this is the very grand first-class dining room on board. Now, as oil-burning engines came along, the advantages there helped enormously. Those advantages, the advances in technology, made things a lot easier. But it still wasn't enough to make a fast ship profitable. In one day, on an eastbound voyage, which is the easier voyage, the Queen Elizabeth burnt over 1,000 tons of fuel. Multiply that by a 4-day journey, which was the fast journey they were doing then. You need an oil well to keep the thing going. It was a desperately expensive business. And another disadvantage of running a blue ribbon holder was the impact on the structure and the mechanics of the ship. It wasn't at all uncommon for blue ribbon holders, as they lost their prize to a new ship coming along, to just collapse because they had been put through so much strain over the period that they were challenging and winning. Operators had to face another challenge as well, of running giant ocean liners. As the ships got bigger, so the harbours and the piers had to be bigger as well. When the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth were brought into service, the ports of Southampton, Le Havre, Cherbourg, all had to be dredged and extended to allow them to operate from there. New York had to have new piers built for exactly the same reason. Now, all of these eventually led to the disappearance of speed as the major factor of the grand liners, but not as much as the impact of the arrival of air travel. Because if you wanted to get from Europe to the US or the other way around fast, in the 1950s you now had a new way of doing it. And it was extremely uncomfortable, it was extremely noisy, it still took many more hours than it would take today, but you could do it in a day. Whereas by ship you had to provide at least 4 or 5 days to be able to do it. And no company, no government could continue running loss-making ships as they were doing before. But let's get back to the beginning of the story. The idea of building a line of transatlantic steamships was really first raised in 1832 by an American lawyer turned London merchant by the name of Junius Smith. And he proposed that at that stage, a transatlantic crossing took 57 days. He proposed that they should speed things up by the use of innovation and technology. And he's considered to be the father of the Atlantic liner. He formed the British and American Steam Navigation Company to operate a London to New York service. Now, about the same time, the question of Atlantic steamships was being discussed in an 1835 meeting of the board of directors of the newly formed Great Western Railway Company. The Great Western Railway Company operated between London and Bristol. Well, at least that was the plan. They hadn't built the whole line by that stage, but their chief engineer, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who I'm sure you have heard of, put forward the proposal that they should continue the journey by providing liner services across the Atlantic, so that you would take a train from London to Bristol, transfer to a ship, and then travel on to New York. The next year, the Great Western Steamship Company was established. The railway line was still years from being completed, but they determined that they were going to do this. By 1838, the Great Western was ready for the sea. But Smith's first ships weren't. They didn't have their engines yet. And so the Great Western had its first scheduled sailing book. Laird suggested that the British and American charter the Irish sea steamer Sirius for 2 voyages to beat the Great Western. And Sirius left the port of Cork, Queenstown as it was called then. Today it's called Cove, and you may well have been there on a cruise. They left the port of Cove about 4 days before the Great Western left the port of Avonmouth, the port for Bristol in the southwest of England. And they were convinced that Sirius would not just get there first, but would get there 4 days at least before the Great Western. Well, it got to the stage where they had used so much fuel that the crew of Sirius had to start burning parts of the ship. They were burning staves and masts and various things because they had no fuel to get there in time. Their westbound crossing was at a speed of 8 knots. I guess at the moment we're probably doing about 7 or 8 knots. And at the time, that was enormously fast. It's often considered the first record holder, but the truth is the Great Western herself became the prototype for all successful ships of the time, and she arrived, having left 4 days later from Avonmouth, she arrived in New York just 1 day behind the Sirius. If you walked along the boardwalk in Halifax, you will almost certainly have walked past the statue to Samuel Cunard. Sam was born in Halifax in 1787 to an American family who fled America during the American Revolution. But he became a committed Canadian and a committed royalist because Canada still has our king as its head of state. And he was committed to developing services between the UK and North America. And New York-Liverpool was the main line that they operated. Cunard broke the record in 1856 with their ship, the Persia, against Collins, who were their main competitors. Having beaten them with Persia, they then went on to improve with a ship called Scotia in 1862. And it was the largest ship in the world at the time with a gross tonnage of about 4,000 tons. We are 32,000 tons, and we're not a big ship by any stretch of the imagination. So Quest is 8 times as large. And if you think about that in terms, it wouldn't be difficult to have fitted that ship in sort of here to the lobby or the atrium. It wouldn't have been difficult to fit in that space at all. So we're about 32,000 tons. Encore and Ovation are 40,000. Scotia had a paddle wheel, which was used in conjunction with the sails. She was made of iron, and she held the blue ribbon on and off for 13 years. The next development in technology was the propeller. Up to this point, sails and wheels were the technology in use. Along came the propeller. Now, Britannic, which was officially known as a sailing steamer, was launched in 1874. Still used sails to complement the steam power, but with a propeller as opposed to Scotia's paddle wheel, she was able to go much faster. The direction was much more precise, and in 1875 she made the crossing at nearly 16 knots, so twice as fast, but at a cost of 100 tons of fuel a day. Now that 100 tons per day had to be carried on board, which reduced the capacity for carrying passengers and anything else. So you see why I make the point that the cost of fuel wasn't just the physical spend, it was the impact on the ability to carry. So ships became more expensive. Thomas Ismay, the founder of the White Star Line, came up with a plan of an annual government subsidy to help to fund the development and operation of the ships, to allow those ships to become more sophisticated technologically, but to be available to government when needed, in this case to the British Admiralty, to provide troop carriers or other forms of defence or warships. In 1886, Harland and Wolff were instructed to produce the best ship, the finest ship afloat. Teutonic, this one, had a gross registered tonnage of 9,984 tons, just under 10,000 tons. It was the first armed cruiser being built for the British Admiralty, and it was a costly business. Her maiden voyage was on the 7th of August. She was joined in 1890 by her sister ship, the Majestic. I mean, names that suggest massive size. But they were about a third of the size of this ship. Cunard countered with two even faster ships, the Campania and the Lusania, in 1893. The Lusania was 1893. And that ship next year recorded a voyage speed of 21.8 knots. We would be most unlikely to travel at that sort of speed on this ship, unless we had a desperate need, possibly to get a passenger to a medical centre or something. Inman became the American line and ordered 2 additional express liners. They were ordered from American yards, but they didn't set out to beat the Cunarders in speed. They set their focus on luxury and value for money. But meanwhile, Germany was targeting itself to build up its mercantile and naval fleets to equal those of the British. So from 1897, German liners swept all of the opposition out of the way when it came to the Blue Riband. First with Norddeutsche Line, or North German Lloyd, with the Kaiser Wilhelm de Grosse. Then the slightly larger Deutschland, which was owned by the Hamburg America line, and that pushed up the transatlantic speed record to 24 knots. And it succeeded in holding the Blue Riband for less than a year before North German Lloyd resumed their supremacy. Following the Kaiser came the second of the 4 Bremerhaven ships, the Kaiser Wilhelm, the Kronprincess Cecile, Kronprinz Wilhelm and Kaiser Wilhelm de Grosse. And each of these added in terms of size, in terms of speed, and in terms of luxury. But the most dramatic episode in the Kronprinz Wilhelm's career, I mentioned very briefly earlier on, was during the 1914-18 war. She was converted to a stalking cruiser and let loose into the North Atlantic. She sunk 60,000 tons of British shipping in a year. But she ran out of supplies. She took shelter in Hampton Roads Harbour and was then requisitioned by US America and eventually served as a US troop carrier for the rest of the war. Thomas Ismay's The White Star Line gradually rose up to become one of the most prominent shipping lines in the world, providing passenger and cargo services between the British Empire and the United States. So they were operating on the Pacific as well as the Atlantic side. Of course, the Great Depression brought things into cold focus. And Cunard and White Star both suffered in the 1930s from decline in business. And it was only by coming together that they were able to form a viable entity beyond then. Cunard White Star Line operated until 1950. Cunard Line then operated as a separate entity until 2005, and it is now, as we are, it is now part of Carnival Corporation plc. As a lasting reminder of the White Star Line, White Star Service is used to describe Cunard's premium service stories. But back to our story. It wasn't for everyone to stay in the race. Other shipping companies focused primarily on speed. White Star branded their services by focusing much more on the comfort of their passengers, both for the upper class passengers and for those travelling as immigrants. Michael Palin tells the story. You know Michael Palin, the adventurer, of Monty Python actor and so on. He tells the story of his great uncle Harry, who died in the Somme in the First World War. But before that, he died serving for New Zealand, because before that he emigrated to New Zealand. And he was lucky. He was able to travel in second-class accommodation on the ship. There were about 70 people in second class, about 20 in first class. And in second class, he actually had a cabin and access to a bathroom. Below second class, there was third class, with about 270 passengers. And below that was what was called immigrant class, which was really only a few steps up from the coffin ships that I showed you before. And that was in 1907. And at that stage, New Zealand was subsidising those crossings for them. It would be unfair of me to say it was the same as the coffin ships. They weren't, of course they weren't. But they were shared accommodation, divided by sex. So the genders of a family would be separated, women and children one end of the ship, men at the other, and they wouldn't even see each other until they reached their destination. Since 1902, Cunard had been making plans for a pair of giant liners which would be equipped with even more powerful reciprocating engines driving twin screws. And they intended to win the blue ribbon and bring back control. So just as they had in 1862, when it was a question of paddle versus screws, the Cunard Company arranged for two ships to be built to test new technologies, the Coronia and the Carmania. Lusitania joined as the third of these, and Lusitania was to be the winner. When World War I broke out in 1914, Lusitania was at sea. She arrived home safely and was kept in her regular Liverpool to New York service during the war. But on the 7th of May 1915, Lusitania was torpedoed by a U-20 and sank within just 18 minutes. The commander of the U-boat, Kapitan Schweiger, was awarded a medal for his heroic deed. I mean, it was a pretty dynamic attack. But for Europe, I would say the major benefit, if you can consider it a benefit, of the attack on the Lusitania was the decision by the United States to enter the war. Because had that not happened, we can only imagine what might have become. So with the loss of life on Lusitania in mind, we should also remember that not all the passengers were travelling successfully. Some of them didn't make it. We know they weren't all travelling in enormous luxury. Things had improved dramatically, but they were travelling with promises of streets paved with gold. That of course, is an exaggeration, but they were promised a better life when they got there. And when they came through the Verrazano Narrows, for example, which we exited New York through and under the bridge wasn't there then, of course, but as they passed through the Verrazano Narrows, they would see Ellis Island, which was where they were to be processed. and the emotions, you can only imagine what emotions were going through. The challenges of new life, the uncertainties and so on. Anyway, back to the race. So this photo is of the Bremen and the Europa in Bremerhaven in 1929. They were built and designed specifically to take the blue ribbon back from the British. The sister ships were built in Hamburg, and the intention was that they were going to make their maiden voyages simultaneously and race themselves across the Atlantic. But a fire delayed Europa's launch for almost a year. But when she got into service, she took the baton back shortly after entering service. The only blue ribbon winner from the Mediterranean was this ship, the Rex, which took the title from Europa in 1933 when she raced from Gibraltar to the Ambrose Light in 4 days, 13 hours and 58 minutes. And remember, the challenge was average speed, not the time of the crossing, and her average speed was 28.9 knots. You're really rattling at that sort of speed. And then, as I say, in 1935, the Hales Trophy was introduced. The rules didn't quite correspond to the traditional rules for the blue ribbon. The trophy could be awarded to the fastest ship in either direction. And I guess with steam-powered ships, it made it more sensible, but there were still challenges. And it could be awarded to any surface ship achieving the fastest speed in either direction. There were some other rule changes which further complicated the situation. For example, even before the trophy was completed, Hales had made arrangements to present it to the Rex, the Italian ship I've just shown you. And in the meantime, Normandy, the French ship, took the record. And Hales had to change the rules to say that the current holder had to be given 3 months to re-challenge anybody who had beaten them in the race. Now, this is a photo of the main dining room of the Normandy. I think it probably was the grandest ship ever afloat. Absolutely spectacular. And some of those panels have appeared in some of the more modern cruise ships that are afloat. She won the title in 1935, lost it a year later to the Queen Mary at a speed of 30.63 knots. A year later, Normandy regained the title with a speed of 31 knots, just marginally better, but lost it only 4 months later again, and this time for good. She was later taken over to become the American troop ship Lafayette, but was destroyed by fire in New York in 1942. Queen Mary became the new ruler of the North Atlantic, and in 1938 took the title with a crossing speed of 31.69 knots. Depression had put the build of Queen Mary in doubt, and it was the government's £9.5 million subsidy. I mean, just think of that in the 1930s, £9.5 million, that's a lot of money, on condition that Cunard and White Star joined together to bring her into service. The Queen Mary was 81,000 tons, so nearly 3 times the size, there's twice the size of Encore or Ovation. She was the largest, the longest ship ever launched, and she eventually entered service after undertaking a round Britain glory tour to be shown off to the nation. During World War II, as I say, thanks to their high speed, the Queens were generally credited with a major contribution to the war. They were also allowed to travel without convoy protection because nothing could catch them, and that proved to be the case as well. But late in 1942, Queen Mary was coming down the west of Scotland when she encountered a convoy with the escort vessel HMS Curaçao. Her instruction was to weave. She was told not to go as fast as possible, but to use her lane well. Curaçao was also instructed to weave, but instead was going in a straight line. And that was done to confuse enemy submarines because they expected the ship to zigzag. Each captain has a different interpretation of what happened. Each captain had a different interpretation of the rule of the road or the rule of the sea. In the confusion, the Queen's bows sliced straight through the Curaçao without the slightest jolt being felt on board. Her captain was not allowed to stop. His instructions were very clear. You stop for nothing. So he continued on to Liverpool, and only a handful of the shattered Curaçao's crew survived the icy waters. The Queen Mary's crew were exonerated, although there was some conflict of opinion in the Admiralty at the time. The United States is described as the last of the great super speed liners. It's not quite true, but she is certainly the one who took and holds the accolade of being the fastest liner on the North Atlantic. She took the record from Queen Mary in 1952 with a record crossing taking 3 days, 10 hours and 40 minutes. So that was an average speed of 35.59 knots. Twice the speed that we might typically travel at when we're in a bit of a pace to get somewhere. And it's worth noting that both the United States and the Queen Mary could travel in reverse faster than any passenger ship in service today. In reverse. She was heavily subsidized by the US government, as the Queen's had been, outwardly a luxury liner, but the United States' speed potential made her a troop carrier and an extremely fast and well-defended personal transport for the United States, and the potential to be used as a sort of Air Force One of the seas. By the time the United States had hit the water for the first time, the travellers of the 50s were no longer looking for fast travel by ship because the jet engine had arrived. The introduction of the Comet and various succeeding aircraft changed things enormously. And she completed her last voyage, voyage number 400, in November 1969, less than 20 years after she came into service. That really is no time for a modern liner. She had a checkered career since then. Laid up in Virginia, towed over to Europe, sold to Norwegian Caribbean Line for a while, placed on the National Register of Historic Places back in Philadelphia, purchased from NCL by the SS United States Conservancy in 2009, and left in uncertainty pretty much ever since. The latest, just before COVID, was the plan for a permanently moored 600,000 square foot hospitality and exhibition space. And the idea was put out to tender to a number of cities around the coast of America: Miami, New York, Boston, San Francisco, Seattle. You can name them yourselves. We'll see what happens. The liners marked an era of great glamour. Bob Hope travelled to the United States as a child with his family in third-class accommodation aboard the SS Philadelphia. They passed through Ellis Island like so many millions before and since. And that was on March the 30th, 1908. So they may have left a working class life in the UK as an economic necessity, but he was later to become a frequent first-class traveller by luxury liner. Grace Kelly and Prince Rainier of Monaco conducted their romance partly by transatlantic liner. And many of the great names of Hollywood have travelled this way as well. The heyday of the 50s, many ships a day left New York to start voyages across to the UK and other parts of Europe. And the same thing was happening on Pacific routes on the west coast and on routes from Europe to Australia, New Zealand, Canada and African ports. But it was the development of air liners that were to change everything. And if you look at this, you think of the Pan Am Clippers. They had on board bedrooms with shower facilities. They had restaurant areas. They had lounge areas. And they were trying to replicate what people were used to travelling by sea. Another ill-fated attempt to compete with the ships was the Hindenburg, which provided all the comfort of a luxury liner with a speed advantage. But of course, as we know, that didn't last. And I suppose that bars and in-flight massages on A380s and Dreamliners today are a new attempt to humanize travel. There were some that got away, particularly in terms of not achieving the blue ribbon. The Olympic in 1910 was the first of the series of ships being built by Harland and Wolff. The Titanic, the sister ship, the Gigantic, which never actually saw the sea. Titanic was to change everything, really. But those ships were never designed for fast travel. They were designed for luxury. Their intended top speed was 21 knots, which is, as I say, about our intended top speed here. Olympic was in the basin when Titanic was launched on the 31st of May 1911. So the two largest ships in the world were side by side for a short while before Olympic left for Liverpool. Her maiden voyage was on the 14th of June, and she made the crossing in 21.17 knots, so nowhere near the sort of best. Walter Lloyd famously said, "The Titanic has cast a spell on all who built and sailed in her, so much so that as the years go by, she grows even more fabulous." We know that she was launched on the 31st of May 1911, sailed on the 10th of April 1912, and she had a gross registered tonnage about 1,000 more than the Olympic. But we all know pretty well what happened. She had a double-skinned hull. She had watertight partitions to prevent the flow of water from one compartment to another, but they didn't go high enough. And the water came in higher up the ship. And some people have suggested that she was fighting to achieve a speed award. Well, she wasn't, because if that had been the case, she would have been much further on in the time in which she was travelling. These ships were built for luxury, not for speed. The realization that speed was unachievable economically had already become quite clear. If you get to Belfast sometime, do go to the Titanic Museum. Have you been? No. Oh, okay. Well, if you get the chance, do. It is absolutely very, very special. The Queen Mary II and even her successor, the QE2, could have made a pretty good stab at the transatlantic speed record. And it's likely that either of them would at least have matched the United States. But that's about time for me to stop. I've been going for 50 minutes, so it's about time for me to stop. I'm very happy to take any questions, but I'm aware that Andrew is on here shortly, and we'll take it from there. So, Robert.
Yeah, just to finish off, the SS United States, yesterday they signed an agreement with the state of Florida. It's going to become the largest reef in the world.
Okay, okay. Yeah, what a loss. Just yesterday, you say? Okay, well, there we are. So we keep you up to date. Yesterday's news on Columbus's DNA and yesterday's news on the United States. Yes, sir?
James Bond movie, there was a ship in Hong Kong that capsized or something. Was that right?
It was the Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth, yes. Unfortunately, Queen Mary went to Long Beach. Queen Elizabeth went to Hong Kong. Queen Mary, I don't know if you've been, but it's really rather a sad walk around because it's It's just sad. The Queen Elizabeth didn't make it. The QE2 is operating as a luxury hotel in Dubai. And that's still rather nice. They've done that rather well. Okay, well, I'm going to leave you. I think we're both back tomorrow, Bob, are we? Yeah? So we will see you at Liars Club at 6:15 tonight. Don't miss that opportunity. And then we're back tomorrow, and I'm going to be talking about language and culture around the world from my background as a commercial diplomat, looking at how different people think. But it's a very light-hearted look at those subjects. So enjoy the rest of today, and do join us tomorrow. Thank you very much.